Israel's government passed the first major legislation in a controversial judicial reform. One side says this reform will save democracy, the other side, this reform will ruin democracy. And with all your experience in government, what's your thoughts on this?
So first of all, if you accept there's judicial overreach in Israel, because there is no checks and balances within the political system, what the government is doing is replacing judicial overreach with political overreach. Total power. Without putting in place within the system any checks and balances which exist in any democratic country worth its salt.
Okay. They say that the Supreme Court is politically...
I just said that. Even if you accept that, the government are now replacing that with complete political control, removing all checks and balances. Okay, that is not acceptable. So if the government was genuine about what it's seeking to do and says the problem is the judiciary has too much power, then what it would do is propose an entirely new electoral system in Israel, for a start. The current system is fundamentally flawed. So that's what Israel needs, an entirely new electoral system, whether it's single transferable vote, first past the post, whatever it is. The current system...
Or they could just reform the Supreme Court.
No, because if you do what they are proposing to do, as I say, you get rid of the checks.
I'm saying reform the Supreme Court where there's a proper Supreme Court that isn't politically held, so that it's totally independent, away from the government, and it's actually a proper Supreme Court that can actually have the proper checks and balances.
No, what you need is a situation where there's a recognition in Israel that any executive that has power there needs to be checks and balances on that executive. Now, if people feel the courts have too much power, in that case, you have to create other mechanisms within the system that ensure those checks and balances exist. In America, you have the Congress and the Senate. In the United Kingdom, you have the House of Lords. You also, by the way, have the right to judicial review if you do not like a decision of a government or a government agency. Mm-hmm. So those are all of the problems. But let's talk some basics. This is a proxy in Israel, this debate, for a far wider range of issues. Let's be frank. There is a lot of mistrust and hatred between the secular part of Israeli society and the more religious Haredi part of Israeli society. You have two extremists in the current Israeli government that, in my view, do not belong anywhere in Israel's democracy in terms of holding power. You have a prime minister who many people will say over many years has been a good prime minister, a good leader. It's time he left the stage because Israel cannot heal as long as he remains prime minister. 50% of the population love him, 50% hate him, and the idea that he's indispensable is a nonsense. I know many indispensable people, and sadly most of them are either in Failsworth, Agecroft or Rainson. You need to create the space for new leadership. And the final point I'll make is this. What we desperately need in Israel is this. People to bring Israeli society together from all parts of this debate. From the Haredi community, from the secular community, from the Ashkenazi community, from the Sephardi community, and say it is a disaster for Jewish people across the world that there is this level of polarization and division in the state of Israel. We need people committed to unity, to healing, to bringing together, to building trust, to breaking down barriers, not erecting barriers, fueling the flames of division. That's what we desperately need urgently. We've just been through a Jewish festival where we have learned that the worst conceivable thing in terms of the Jewish people's relationship with God is division. It's the thing that has caused the Jewish people the most problems through its history. When Jewish people are divided, and it's baseless hatred, it has caused more problems than anything else in Jewish people's history. And yet we have learned nothing from that in terms of the way the different parties are behaving in Israel right now. So those who wish to say one party is to blame, the other party is to blame, I'm afraid to say they're missing the point. We need leadership and we need people of goodwill who are willing to heal these wounds, to build bridges, yes, and to recognise that people have legitimate grievances on both sides of the argument. They do, okay? We need to recognise that, we need to acknowledge it, we need to validate it, but then we need to find common ground. The President has tried to do that. I think he's done a good job in trying to do that. He's failed so far. So we need leaders to step up to the plate who are committed to that type of approach to tackling some of these problems within Israel. But I'll go back to this. A brave politician needs to come forward and stand for election in the next Israeli elections and say, if you elect me, I will bring forward proposals to radically reform the Israeli electoral system. If that doesn't happen, we're going to continue to have these problems.
So it's good that Ivan recognises that electoral systems need changing. That's excellent. In terms of those party systems, clearly the party list system is the worst of all because of the way it gives power, and it creates tribalism. That is the problem with giving too much power to political parties, these artificial constructs, because what it does is that people then buy into that and start to go further and further within that system and say, no, we have to be right on everything and they have to be wrong on everything. So it creates that. For Israel, it actually seems control won't work particularly well because you could then have proper representation within multi-member constituencies of local people who could then have a voice, and it would bring politicians closer to people, which is desperately needed in Israel because they are totally removed from the electorate in terms of how it works.
Just part of Lords of the Party. There's absolutely no connection with any community at all.
Correct. So that's one fundamental point. But in terms of what's happened in Israel, it's incredibly worrying. Clearly you need an independent judiciary. That for me, always the best way to have a judiciary is for them to come through the ranks and for the judiciary to decide, and therefore they represent their, the judges, the lawyers, and so on, who are there and who look at the law and look at what needs to be done. What politicians' role is to set the law, to say these are the constraints in which you work. This is what you have to make sure happens. If they want to change things, they debate it in their parliament, and then they change the law, and then the judiciary are meant to uphold the law. It's a pretty straightforward system. What's happened here, as Ivan rightly says, is they've tried to take control of the judiciary away from those judges, away from that independence. And that's why you've got these massive demonstrations on, which are saying, hold on a second, you're fundamentally altering our society. And the problem is that says that, it's this thing that some politicians have that we're always going to be in power, so we're always going to be able to set those rules, when the reality is something different. So, of course, it can then go to swing the other way. It's a nonsense for politicians to be in charge of the judiciary. It should never happen. You need independent judiciary, their role being to actually make sure the law is enacted properly.
I just say though, let's be honest, this is a proxy for many other grievances and divisions. It's a proxy for those who believe that some in Israel want to create a halacha state, a state based on Jewish law. Others believe that the secular part of Israeli society want to get rid of all semblance of a Jewish ethos in terms of the way the state of Israel is organised. So there is massive mistrust on both sides, okay? And that's what this is. The flames are being fanned in terms of those terrible, that terrible level of mistrust. So you need people, as I say, from both camps to say enough of division. And let's have a march in Israel for those who actually want to see compromise, who want to see a coming together, who want to see mutual respect. You know what? If somebody had the courage to organise such a march, I bet you'd get the biggest turnout that you get from all of these demonstrations, these pro the judicial reform, against judicial reform. So the only positive that comes out of this, maybe it's bringing to the surface all these this terrible mistrust and almost hatred, by the way, that exists. And maybe it will require Israel to face up to this. It is horrible to see, and it is very dangerous to say. Israel has horrendous external enemies who want to destroy it. Iran is still developing a nuclear weapon. Iran is still fomenting terrorism. Iran is still the biggest threat, not only to Israel, but to stability in the Middle East and possibly ultimately stability around the world. Yeah? And while all of this division is taking place, it emboldens Israel's enemies, right? It is extremely damaging and dangerous. So we need good leaders and good politicians, not necessarily from the Knesset. They may come from civil society, come from the religious communities, from grassroots, wherever they come from, to say enough. We need to start a dialogue of trust and mutual respect.
Radical centrism, radical compromising. I mean, but it is absolutely. As Ivan knows, I work for We Stand Together, and we're all about those difficult dialogues, listening to each other, and then thinking about how we can progress. It's all about moving people towards seeing the other, empathising, and therefore you can make those better decisions. That's where Israel isn't, and under the present electoral system will not be.
But I want to say one thing that's very important here, that it is true that there are some Haredim who have contempt for anybody who's not religious, but there are as many secular people who have complete and utter contempt for Haredim. So let's be clear about it. Let's be clear about it. And sometimes this is presented in a very narrow, very biased and skewed way. And it's not just a debate between people, Haredim and secular. There's also Ashkenazi and
All different
Sephardi.
people.
There's left wing and right wing. And if you look, as I say, at Ben Gvir and Smotrich, I don't care what anybody says, it is a disgrace that they are serving in an Israeli government. If Jewish people want to legitimize, and Jonny and I will agree on this, want to legitimize and justify racism anywhere in the world, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in Israel, right, we should not have anything to do with them. We want people to march alongside us in the fight against anti-Semitism, whether it's against Corbyn in Britain, whether it's against what's happened in France, wherever anti-Semitism is taking place. So we, more than anybody, have got to stand out against racism of any kind. And I'm afraid these two characters in the past and now hold views which are abhorrent. Okay, and it's the Israeli system that allows people like that to end up in positions of power, exercising and wielding such levels of power. So we've also got to understand that this is a very, very difficult and sad time. We still, in my opinion, Israel is still a democracy. It's a vibrant democracy, right? It's still, in terms of the region, is miles ahead of its neighbours in terms of being that vibrant democracy. But anybody who cares about the future of Israel or the Jewish people needs to recognise this baseless hatred, this level of division is a disaster for Jewish people, not just in Israel, but across the world.